Hello everyone, today we continue learning Python and today I'll show you how to create a settings class from JSON in Python. So let's start. But before we start that video, I recommend you subscribing to my Telegram channel. You will find lots of materials, modules, libraries, examples and tasks on Python in my Telegram channel. Also, I post all the announcements there, so if you want to understand what will happen to the channel in the near future, you can go here. And I respond to comments much faster than I do it on YouTube. So subscribe to my Telegram channel, link in the description down below. Well, you may not understand me at first, but let me explain. So let's create a file called settings.json. I don't see that file in here, but oh yeah, package.json, but let's rename it to be settings.json. So settings.json, it's a file that will contain our settings. And imagine that you are building a module. So you are building a library, an API, and so on. And you need to have settings. It's very convenient to put settings into a file, settings.json file, because if you have many instances of your program, you can put various settings inside of every instance. And JSON is dynamic, so you don't have the real structure. What you have is, of course, you have a structure of like the JSON itself, but you can add any fields whenever you want. Today, what we'll do, we'll create a file or a Python class that will contain all of our settings, and later in our application, we will be able to use them. So I have settings.py file, and let's create a class called settings, like that. So we'll import that settings class in any Python file, and we'll use it later. And of course, we want to use JSON, so let me import JSON. Okay, so what we need to do right now? Right now, I want to show you the method that I think is the best for JSON, for that kind of JSON settings from the file. What I need to do, let's for example give node name. So for example, the name of our node, which is master01, then node version, which is for example 1.0.1, then node host, which is local host, and then node port, which is 12345. So these are just my settings. Imagine that we are building a cluster, so we are building a program which will be in the cluster. So we will have many instances of our program. And what we can do, we can create that program, or we can have 5 or 3 servers together, and every server will have our program and settings.json file. Inside of that file, we'll have the node name, so the name of our instance, the version of our instance, because we need to compare the versions to understand that everything works alright, the host of our instance, and the port. It does not matter actually what you're running, but I just want to show you how you can create your settings with JSON. Okay, so now I want to add a list, and I wrote master01 right here, so let's append another JSON key, so node is master, which decides if our node is master or not. So node is master is true in our case, and let's actually these are just keys, and I just show you how you can structure your settings if you want to use these are just settings for the example. And then let's put node slaves like that, and we'll append a list of ports, or a list of, let's append just local host 123.4, then local host I don't know 999, and then for example some http my slave and then 0, for example, some so we append just slaves, so the slaves that will replicate, will work, will help our master to balance the requests, for example, and so on. Okay, so again, if you don't understand that, don't worry, it's just an example, and I show like how we can structure our settings. Okay, now what I want to do, I want to go to settings.py file, and what I want to import is JSON module, because JSON module is the one that helps us to work with JSON in Python. Then let's create settings variable inside of our settings class, or it's better to call it a variable settings, like that. And what I want to put right here, I want to put every settings or every setting that our user can assign in settings.json file. Well, actually what we can do is just copy the keys from here and let's put them right here. So why do we need to do that? Well, imagine that you have a configuration file that has some malicious code inside of it. Probably you don't want to have that malicious code inside of your file. Or probably you want to just shorten the range of your settings, so your user can only assign these settings. And if our user adds, for example, key with the value of 1, we'll raise an exception, so our config is not valid. Okay, let's remove that comma because it will break the JSON. And now what we have? We have settings class with available settings inside of it. And then what we can do is use define initialize. So define initialize again is code when we create our settings object. And what we can put inside of here? Inside of here we can put our the real file. And the real file, which is settings.json. And to use that file without any arguments, without any inputs in our Python program, what we can do is put it in argv. So what is argv? When I run my py main or py settings, let's run py settings.py with another argument, for example, settings.json, what I receive is argv. Now let's import os or no, I think sys, and what we have here is, let's print sys.argv. So argv, it's an array, it's a tuple of every variable that is passed after our py command. So settings.py is on the 0. As you can see, that's just the list. I thought it was a tuple, but it does not matter. So we have settings.py, which is the first argument of our py command. Then we have settings.json. And what we can actually do is use sys.argv from 1. Let's run it again, and settings.json, but there is a problem. If I remove that file, we'll have an index error. And that's why when we use init, what we need to do, or when we put our sys.argv inside of init, what we need to do is try to get that sys.argv. So file name or settings config equals to sys.argv1. But what we need to do in addition is use try. So now what I am doing, our user will pass our config inside of argv. So it will append it and at the end of the program. Okay, so again, I run py, actually any script, main.py, because sys.argv is for all the scripts, is for your Python session, for your whole Python program. So you can run your main.py file and put settings.config here or settings.json in our case here, and it will still receive that settings.json in our settings.py file. So don't worry about that. Now, when I run my py main.py, I will need to supply our settings file. And if I do not do that, what I need to receive is an error. So settings config equals to sys.argv1. And let's accept index error, because we'll have an index error if something is not right here. And let's accept it as exception. And let's, for example, print no config found. No config found. Exception, and let's just put that exception right here. So I'll just print the exception. Now let's create our settings file or settings object, and you'll see that everything is created normally. So if I provide settings.json right here, let's print settings config. If I provide settings.json right here, let's press enter. As you can see, we have can't open file. Oh no, not main.py, but settings.py. But again, you can call any file you want. And settings.json. As you can see, if I provide settings.json, I have that file right here. But if I do not provide it, let's remove it. I unbound local error settings config reference before assignment. Oh yes, because we need to return if we don't have our config right here. So if we don't have it, as you can see, no config found, exception, list index out of range. Everything is alright. Okay, but now, what if our user does not provide the real path? So for example, we provide A, B, C, D. as you can see, everything works not quite how we want it to work. Because if we don't have that file in our local system or on any endpoint, what we need to do is raise an exception. And how we can do that? Well, actually, if you want to use files on different endpoints, then you should use some kind of technology. For example, you need to receive that file, you need to open it from a different server, but for simplicity, I'll just use open. So let's, and actually you can put it inside of a try right here. Let's open our file with open as file or as config underscore file. And what I'm doing right here, I'm opening a file that our user provided to us. And then what I need to do is open that file in read mode, because we get JSON file and we need to read it. Okay, now let's run it again and boom, we receive an error, file not found error. Let's accept that, accept file not found error, because file exists will never be raised because we read from the file and we need it to, if it does not exist, then we will have an error, like that's real. Okay, what I can do here is, let's print, actually it's better to use login, but for the simplicity and for the example, I'll just use print. No config argument found, comma, but there is no file exception, and we print our exception. Now, if I will provide ABCD, I'll receive config argument found, but there is no file, and no such file or directory ABCD. But if I will provide settings.json, everything is alright. So as you can see, we have no errors. Now, what I need to do here as config file? Well, actually, we need to get all the JSON from that file. And to do that, what we can use is actually JSON. So JSON module, JSON.loads. Actually, we can provide, we can use load, because load and the loads, their only difference is that load function in JSON accepts, I don't know if you can see it, but it accepts FP, so file stream, but loads accepts like the file content. It accepts the content. For example, I can put a string hello right here and will translate it to JSON. Okay. Actually, I think, yeah, it's better to use JSON load. So what we need to do is use, let's remove that, JSON load. We will provide a file inside of here and we'll receive it in our user settings variable, like that. So as you can see, what are we doing right here? JSON load will open. Actually, you can watch my video about JSON where I explained it in details, but JSON load opens a file, so we provide a file stream inside of it, and JSON load converts all of the data, so all of the JSON we have right here, to a Python object, to user settings. Okay, now let's print it. Let's print user settings. So now, if I run my program with settings.json, I receive the real JSON. If I run it with settings.json O, but we don't have that file. Config argument found, but there is no file. That's right, but if I run it without any arguments, no config found, exception list index out of range. Everything works alright. And what we need to do now? Now we have all of our user settings. And what I recommend you doing is check that we have only these keys, like only them. Okay, how we can do that? Well, actually we have available settings, and instead of a tuple, we can use them as sets. So set in Python, it's set in Python, it's kind of a list without any with all of the unique values. So we only have unique values inside of that set, but also it's hashable. So there are some deep things about it, but in short, it's just a list with unique values. Okay, not list, but it's better to say container or hash table, because it uses hashes, but strings are hashable in Python and everything is alright right here. Well, now we have our available settings and we have our user settings. And what we should do? We should check that every setting in available settings is set. And we don't have any additional settings in user settings. How we can do that? Well, what we can do is use for user setting in user settings, and then use like any function if user setting in available settings, but I want to use another method that I thought of right now. What if we change available settings to slots? So slots in Python allow you to only use these arguments. So in normal Python classes, what you can do is use settings.x equals 10. And after that line, you'll have x inside of your settings object. But with slots, I don't know if you can see it, but it says setting object attribute x is read only. So we don't have our attribute x and we cannot assign it because we have our slots. So slots just show what variables you can assign in your Python object. And because of that, if we have any additional keys in our settings.json file, we receive an error because we cannot create any additional variables in our Python object. But if we have any, if we will not set, for example, node name, we'll forget about it and we'll just go without it in our settings.json file. We'll still receive an error because what I want to do for user setting in user settings, what I want to do is use self set utter, or let's just actually use set utter. So set utter self name is user setting, and let's go to values, user setting key. I'll explain what it does. User setting key, user setting value, key, and user setting value, like that. So what are we doing right here? We have slots, so we shorten the range of variables that can be created to that array, to that tuple. Then we get the config from our sysRGV. We get all the JSON to Python object in that line, and then for every value, so for every key and for every setting, and I think you know that node name is key and master01 is setting, for example, what we are doing right here, we use setUtter function to self user setting key, user setting value. So what it does, I'll just show you a little piece of code and you'll understand what it does in a minute. So imagine that we have class A and we don't have anything inside of it, so we just use pass, so we don't receive an error. Then I'll create object equals A. So now we have object and I can show that nothing is here. Then I'll use setUtter on object. Then I'll put, for example, x as 10. Now, when I'll press enter, as you can see, I have x value inside of my object. So setUtter just creates a variable from the string you supply. Or if I'll put again x for 12, it will change the value of the variable. So it either changes or creates a variable. It's very similar to object.x equals 10, but in that case we can provide strings, so real strings right here, and that is much more convenient. Okay, now what I want to do, I want to create an attribute for self, so for that specific object, using user setting key, so the keys we have right here, and using user setting value, so the values we have in our settings.json. Then I set all the variables, and I know right now that I have all these slots almost, that I don't have any additional variables, because if I will put comma A, which is like that, but I don't have A in my available settings, when I run my code, I'll receive cannot import settings from test. I think I ran the wrong piece of code. Run settings. Oh yeah, because we need to provide the config. That's why I chose the terminal. So py settings.py, settings.py, settings.json. Let's run it, and as you can see, value error, too many values to unpack. That's not what I wanted, because you know what's the problem? When we let's print user settings right here, and I'll show you why it's happening. Print user settings. But let's run it using our terminal again, by settings.py. As you can see, we have node name, node master. Actually, I don't know what's the problem. Let me think. In user settings values, user setting key, user setting value. Let's remove that and let's just stick with the key. I'll comment out that line with setUtter, and then I'll print user setting key just to see what's the result. Let's run it, and yeah, everything's alright. We have keys. But why something is wrong when I set my variables? User setting value. Yeah, let's copy that and let's paste it right here. So I roll back to my code, and what's the problem? Let's actually print setting user setting key, and let's put that key inside of here. So setting key, comma, and our user setting key, like that. Let's rerun our code, and what do we see? Settings for user setting value in user setting values, too many values to unpack. Why is that happening? I really don't know. Let's just go right like that. Let's run it again, and setting key master 01. That's really strange because I use values in here, but I have user settings. Again, user settings is a dictionary, and let's call its type like that. Let's run it again, and we have dictionary. And when I use values, I get the values for my dictionary. Well, I really don't know, and if you know, just tell me why, because it's really strange. Okay, so user setting key. I think there is a comma or something like that. I don't really know. Okay, now instead of values, but you can use values. I don't really know what's the problem, and go down in the comments to see if I found the answer. For every user setting key, what I'm doing right here, I print it, so just to see, and then I set the attribute self for user setting key and for user settings from user setting key. It's not optimized because we get the key right here, and then we also look up the value for the key. And it's better to use values, but still since we are using that in the config, it will take only a minute. Like, we don't have a big JSON file. But again, it's better to use values. Again, I don't really know why. So now what are we doing right here? We set all the keys that are in our available slots. But then when we set key A, we have attribute error. Settings object has not attribute A. Why? Because again, I use slots. And slots define what variables you can assign and can create inside of the settings object or settings class. And because of that, what we can do is use except attribute error. Let's print it as exception. And what we can do is use wrong setting provided in the file. And let's put exception right here. So exception like that. So now, when I run my code again, what you will see, wrong setting provided in the file, exception, settings object has no attribute A. And if I remove that attribute, let's remove it, let's run it again, what we'll see? We will see that we have no errors. And now I can only set the variables inside of my slots. However, that does not mean that I can remove all the variables. If I remove node master, or node name, which is required, I will still receive no errors. But we don't have node name, and that can be very, very bad in different programs. Because of that, what we should do is use let me think, what is the best solution? Well, self slots, let's use getOther. So getOther is similar to setOther, but it just gets the attribute by its name. So what we can do is getOther self comma attribute, so ather, for ather in self slots. So what are we doing right here? I created a generator. Statement seems to have no effect, but actually it does. Or let's call it all settings, like that. So now what are we doing right here? We for every attribute in slots, so for node name, for node isMaster, for node version, for node host port, and so on, for every attribute, we are trying to get that attribute from our object. And if we do not provide any attribute inside of our settings.json, what we can do, or what we receive, is an error. Let's run it again, and there is no error, I think, because when we have all the available settings, there is no error. But if I remove node name, for example, let's run it again, no error still. Why? Okay, let's print all settings like that. Let's run it again, and generator, everything is alright. Let's go to the list, or let's translate it to the list, and run setting provided in the file, exception node name. Yeah, actually that's it. So now, yeah, I understand why the error is happening. So in Python, generators are lazy, so we only execute the function getAttr when we translate, or when we go to that specific object, so to that specific index. In our case, what's happening if we remove print list? We only create the generator, but we actually never request the values, and that's why it's better to call it, or to serialize translate it to a list, and only after that, I think we can remove this parenthesis. Yeah, and only after that so we get all the lists, we get like the whole settings, and if we don't have any setting, then we'll go to wrong setting provided or missing in the config file, like that. Let's run it again, and wrong setting provided or missing in the config file, exception node name. But if I put node name in here, node name, for example, node 001, let's run it again, everything is alright. And why do we even need to do that? Well, actually, because that is the whole file, or the whole class, that will help you to create configs from JSON. So now we can query any variable, for example, node version. Let's print it, node version. Let's run our settings again, but in the terminal, because again, I need to provide the value. I know that I can do it in PyCharm, but I don't want to spend my time on that. Now let's write py settings.py settings.json. Let's run it. As you can see, when I require, or when I request node version, I get 101. Let's change it to 2. Let's run it again, 102. Now we created a very flexible config from our JSON file. And if you, for example, want to run your module or your library or your program inside of a Docker, you don't even need to put any environment variables, because you can put every configuration inside of here. But be sure to encrypt the JSON, because, yeah, because if you put passwords, that is not alright. Unencrypted passwords, of course. And now, if I want to add any setting, I don't even need to go inside of my init file. For example, let's append what setting? Let's append max connections. Max connections. Let's go to settings.json, and let's put max connections as 10, for example. And let's remove the trailing comma. Max connections 10. Let's run it again with our terminal. As you can see, let's call max connections. Let's run it again. As you can see, the value is 10. But if I forget to put max connections in one of my configs, let's run it again, we'll receive an error. Attribute error max connections. I know why is that happening, because we create everything in it, we just print our values, but actually what we should do is exit. So exit from 0 or from -1, because 0 means that everything is alright, but -1, something is not alright. And as you can see now, when we don't have max connections, we just say wrong settings provided or missing in the file config, in the config file, exception max connections. If I provided max connections as 10, let's remove that, and let's write it again. As you can see, it's 10. Of course, we have some errors, because if I provide a string in max connections, we'll still have 10, but it's a string and I can provide any value, so like that. But it's not the value for the max connections, I think you understand that. But I will leave it up to you, or if you want me to continue that topic, so continue a series of video about how to create your settings from JSON config, or from any JSON data or from any data in Python, because if you want to use it from Pico, what you need to do actually is just use Pico. If you want to get it from XML, I think we have XML module, but I have never worked with XML in Python. And there are lots of things you can do with that pattern. So that settings class. And I think that's it. So I showed you today how to create a simple Python settings object using any JSON file. And now if you want to move your library to the Docker, to Kubernetes, where you have lots of configs, lots of servers, what you can do is use that pattern, and you provide settings JSON to every program, to every instance of your program, and you have the real way to make your program or program settings work, because I think that's much more convenient than just putting everything in env. And yeah, thank you for the watching and good luck.